So let's get this underway. It's my honor to introduce our moderator for today. She is Sheila Auger, and she is the Dean of Arts of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Waterloo. Sheila, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sandra. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this first event in our Ask Our Experts series. I'm very happy to be here to moderate this conversation, and I am looking forward to discussion with my colleagues and with the community over the next several weeks. I want to thank all of you for attending today's event. I'll be introducing our guest in a moment, but first I just wanted to let you know how these talks will proceed. Our guests will speak for a few minutes about the topic at hand, and then they and I will have a further and more in-depth conversation on the subject. After that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So as Sandra said, in order to ask a question, please remember to use the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your WebEx window. I also have a few questions that some of you sent in ahead of time. I have one last housekeeping note of my own. If the technology freezes up for a bit, please be patient. It may not be you, it may be me. I live in dread of being the one responsible for messing things up, and it's a dread that I think our guest can probably address. So today's guest is Dr. Christine Purdon. Dr. Purdon is a professor in the Department of Psychology, where she's the Director of Clinical Training. She's also a registered psychologist with the College of Psychologists of Ontario, and she's a core faculty member in UW's Centre for Mental Health Research and Treatment. Dr. Purdon has expertise in the assessment and treatment of mood and anxiety disorder in adults. She works on the persistence of anxiety and its cognitive manifestations, such as obsessions, worry, rumination, doubt, and its behavioral manifestations, such as compulsions and escape and avoidance behaviors. So Dr. Purdon is with us today to talk about protecting our mental health in the time of COVID-19. And I'll invite her to turn on her mic and her video now and say, welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Dr. Agarta. Thank you, Sandra. It's a real honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to the community a bit about some of the anxieties that we're experiencing during this unprecedented, as they say, times. Yeah, and so
I thought maybe I would help out just in terms of getting the conversation started. Christine, if you don't mind, I just thought we might start with
Sure.
General questions.
Sure.
Okay, so what kind of struggles are people facing with their mental health right now? And at what point should people seek professional help? And what is considered normal right now? And what should give people cause for concern?
Those are really excellent questions. And I think that's on this kind of thing is on a lot of people's mind now that we're through that initial crazy phase of just trying to adjust to the new realities and figure out how we're going to homeschool kids while we're also working full time, et cetera. Now we're sort of in the phase of what is happening and is this normal and is what I'm feeling a problem or is it just what I would be feeling normally with these circumstances? So excellent questions. And I guess I would start by talking about stress in general. And I think that there's a very useful way to conceptualize stress. And I like to think of it as a quotient, like a fraction. So if you go back to the early math and the math that you may be teaching your children as you're trying to homeschool and work, think of a fraction where the numerator is the demands of the environment and the denominator is our capacity to cope. So when we have a large number of demands and we have less capacity to cope, our stress quotient gets higher and higher and higher. And I think the demands right now of trying to manage during this COVID crisis are quite high for many of us. So, of course, as I've already mentioned, we have competing demands such as doing full-time childcare while trying to do full-time work. We may have financial and job security concerns. We may live in fear for the safety and well-being of our loved ones, particularly if our loved ones are vulnerable, or if we have people who are essential workers or particularly frontline healthcare workers. We also, if we are a frontline healthcare worker or we're somebody who has suffered COVID, we may have some trauma. We may have experienced things that are unprecedented and that were very terrifying for us. We may be grieving for lost loved ones without the opportunity for the kind of mourning processes that we're used to being able to do, which is to physically share our grief. We are also trying to manage life in tight quarters, or we could be in the opposite position of trying to manage life in isolation. So we may be dealing with feeling very alone and lonely and disconnected and alienated. We may also be feeling a lot of relationship stress and family conflict. We are trying to grapple with basic everyday problems, trying to get privacy just to do one or two things on your own, dealing with poor internet. We may have difficulty just getting basic errands done. Going to the grocery store is now actually fairly complex. We may be dealing with a myriad of disappointments like canceled weddings and proms, trips, that sort of thing. We're also having more difficulty getting outside and getting exercise. And those are just the things in our microenvironment. We also have the macro environment, which is there's a global pandemic. There's going to be economic fallout. There already is economic fallout. We're getting a steady stream of distressing news. So we're under a great deal of demands from the environment, and we may also have less capacity to cope than we might in other circumstances. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that the pandemic itself has limited our options for problem solving. So we don't have the same capacity to deal with monotony and boredom in our family by going on a day trip or sending our kids to sports camp or all of those things. We may have financial stresses that just make it harder for us to do things like get takeout rather than prepare a meal. So those are sort of practical things, but also when we're quite anxious, we also, it's interesting because anxiety is a response that's meant to help us cope with threat, but it can also cause us some problems. Anxiety is a great response when there's a very concrete threat. So if there's a venomous spider in your bathroom, it'll help you focus and take action right away and be able to deal with that. But when the threats are sort of more general or vague, like is one of us going to get sick? Are kids going to be okay? Are they going to be able to resume school? Or is my job going to be okay? Anxiety ramps us up and it leaves us all revved up with no place to go. And it also rivets our attention on threat information as opposed to other kind of information. So even though the weather might be beautiful and sunny and there are crocuses coming up in our garden, we may be unable to even notice, let alone appreciate that because our minds are so focused on threat. And as we're going to talk about in a little bit, this is one factor that kind of undermines us. So if we just think of our quotient, we can recognize why many of us may be feeling very, very stressed at this particular time. And then the question becomes, at what point are we feeling stress versus an actual mental health problem? And I would say that telling the difference between stress and a mental health issue is akin to telling the difference between a common cold, even if it's a very serious cold, and pneumonia that requires medical attention. And the big difference is in the symptom complexity, the persistence of the symptoms, and the extent to which they interfere with your ability to carry out the tasks of your major roles. So being stressed is not a mental illness. It's a natural reaction to the circumstances. And I think we don't help people by pathologizing stress and saying that, because you might be anxious right now, there's something wrong with you. No, of course, there are lots of reasons to be anxious right now. So stress is a response to the demands of the environment, and we're all experiencing a lot of demands. Stress will resolve as the demands ease up and as our capacity to cope with them increases. And this is a marathon and not a sprint. And we need to avoid burnout, which we'll talk again about later. But an indication of a more significant mental health problem would be if you're experiencing high degree of anxiety all day, every day, relentlessly, week after week after week. And it's making it really hard for you to actually complete the tasks you need to do for parenting, for work, for your relationships, etc. That becomes more of a concern. And if you are also engaging in truly excessive, cleaning routines, like all of us are washing our hands more often, and we're being more cognizant of transmission of germs and contamination, et cetera. But if we're spending an inordinate amount of the day really preoccupied with that at the expense of other things, doing excessive cleaning rituals, that could be an indication that things are moving in a direction where you might want to consider getting some more support for and help with that. If you have a really low mood, so feeling numb, feeling empty, feeling very sad, and it's making it really hard for you to make decisions or to get out of bed, if you're sleeping a lot more or a lot less, significantly less, if you're eating a lot more or a lot less, and this is happening all day, every day for at least 2 weeks period straight, then it's also time to start to think about getting some extra help, particularly if there are real thoughts of hopelessness and helplessness and thoughts about that you might be better off dead or that you can be better off dead. Obviously, those are suicidal thoughts that we would want you to connect with a mental health professional about. Finally, if you've experienced trauma and you find yourself relentlessly plagued with images or memories, nightmares, if you feel like you're experiencing the event, if you're in a constant state of hypervigilance, if you're excessively avoiding anything that reminds you of the trauma, if you're feeling tainted and broken by the trauma, and all of those symptoms are occurring all together, all day, every day for a very long period of time, that's also time to get some help from a mental health care professional. It's very normal after trauma to feel those symptoms, but it's when they persist for a long time and make it very hard for you to do other things in your day and function in your role that it's really time to think about getting help. So I think the big difference, to sum up, the big difference between stress and having a mental health problem is that even when we're stressed, we can see the bright side of things, we can laugh a little bit, we can take a breather, and we can continue to work and to parent, even if we're not doing it as well as we would be outside of this stressful situation. When it's an actual mental health problem, it's a lot more difficult to see or let alone believe in the bright side. And our mood and anxiety interfere substantially with our ability to do what we need to do. So I would say in a nutshell, that's how I would think about this.
Thank you so much, Christine. That is very, very helpful. I'd like if we could push the conversation a little bit further. One of the things that I think people find stressful is constant bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd sort of like to ask how much news is too much news? And then maybe we can also follow up with any tips or suggestions you have for staying mentally healthy in a very challenging time.
Yeah, that's such an excellent question because one of I mean, there's tons of news out there. It is a very steady stream of very unpleasant things. There are also hopeful things in the news, but when we're anxious or stressed, we tend to attend more to the more stressful things. Also the anxiety makes us threat sensitive. So we're very hypervigilant for information relevant to threat, and we're on a high alert for it. And one of the problems, again, like if it's a venomous spider in your bathroom, it's a concrete threat. You can figure out what you need, what this thing is and what it represents, and you can do something about it. In today's day and age with what's happening in the world, there is an inexhaustible supply of information. So it's not like you can go online, figure out that's the spider, that's how it operates, this is what you need to do about it, done in 5 or 6 minutes. There is an inexhaustible supply of information happening, and it's being updated. We're learning more and more about the COVID-19 illness as well as the coronavirus that causes it, and it's just a constant, steady stream of information. And we can find ourselves getting lost in scrolling for the news on our Facebook or going on different news websites. And there are a couple of problems with doing that limitlessly. The first is you'll never exhaust the supply of information. So you can never get the answers that you're looking for. Secondly, the more time you spend doing that, the more likely you are to find inconsistent information. So it's like, well, they say wear masks, they say don't wear masks. Now what do I do? And then you can go down lots of rabbit holes trying to figure it out for yourself. The third problem is that the more time you spend on it, the more likely you are to come in contact with irresponsible news. So news sources that are inaccurate, that are intended to mislead you, and that are intended to undermine confidence in the very institutions in society that are working very hard to protect us. And so all of those things make our anxiety higher, not lower. So the point of monitoring news is to try to manage our anxiety. It's try to get the information we need to get the control that we feel we can have and get the solutions we want. But we're in a time where we have to live with a fair bit of uncertainty because the information is not a concrete box of facts that we can unpack and look at. There's a lot happening. And so I think it's one of the absolute best ways to manage anxiety and stress and mental health right now is to portion out time for news and maybe set aside 2 times a day, maybe 20 minutes. And those are the times you look at your news and you choose 2 or 3 very good news sources, that is reputable sources with high journalistic standards, where they are responsible, they fact checked before they put stories up. So select 2 or 3 of those, spend 20 minutes updating yourself at the beginning of the day, 20 minutes maybe later in the day if you want, and otherwise turn it off. And I think what you can be, first of all, guaranteed that in today's day and age, if something big changes, you'll hear about it. Like, you're not in danger of missing out on anything in today's day and age, that's for sure. But I think what you'll find is that your anxiety will be much better because you can turn your attention to other things and you can focus on your microenvironment. You can start, instead of losing time being on the internet on things that there's not much you can do about, you can walk away from that, like update yourself, walk away from it, make any changes you need to make in light of the most recent information, like get a mask because they're saying mask now. So, find a way to get a mask, and then take the dog for a walk or prepare a meal or do something that you can control in your microenvironment.
See, I just got a note. I asked them to tell me when I talk when I'm muted. Yes, how long could I have gone on doing that? Probably quite some time. So thanks for the reminder. Yeah, so I think it's time that we open it up for questions, and we'll be doing our best to get to everybody's questions in the time that allows. And we do hope that Christine's presentation will help answer a lot of those questions. And I want to apologize ahead of time in case we aren't able to get to your questions, but we're certainly going to do our best to do so. So I think I'd like to start with some of the questions that people sent in ahead of time, since I think that these are people who are really thinking and looking forward to today's event. So I'll just start with this one, where this individual says, I feel isolated during quarantine time. I know that I should make the most use of my time during quarantine, but I feel much less efficient and productive than before. Do you have any suggestions on improving efficiency and staying positive?
Such a good question. And I think that what this person is describing is something maybe we're all feeling, or many of us are feeling, particularly not feeling as productive or efficient. So I would say 2 things. One is, this is one of my tips as well for avoiding burnout, is really thinking about what are our standards here. We are in unprecedented, and I know everybody's saying, please stop using that word because it's like so overused, but it's actually a really useful word because it is unprecedented. And so we're all trying to adjust to a massive shift. If you think of our lives, if this like 100 years ago now, but imagine our life in the first week of March. Can you even think back to that? Think about how much our lives have changed. And the amount of mental problem solving, mental thought that we're doing as we adjust and as we're trying to plan for an uncertain future, we need to recognize that all of that is mental energy and physical energy that we're expending. And none of us are going to be optimal at this time in terms of our efficiency and our effectiveness. And I think the first thing we need to do is be compassionate towards ourselves and be compassionate towards other people, and accept that it's okay that we're just not going to be functioning at the same level that we used to or that we would ideally like to. That doesn't mean we won't again. It's just that right now in these times, it's just very, very difficult to function as well when we've got so much else going on, particularly for people with small children to care for while they're also trying to do their full-time job, or teenagers who they're very worried about going out and meeting friends. We've got a lot of mentalizing to do, and they're very novel problems. They're not things we've ever really had to think about or solve before. So I think compassion towards ourselves. I think that if people are feeling isolated, of course we can't do physical contact, but what I would say is find ways to reach out in the internet. And so find book clubs online, or there are church services online, after which there are coffee hours or other religious kinds of services. Find a way where you can try to connect with people who share your interests online. Try to connect with family. In the past, we've always sort of, many of us anyway, just sort of call when we feel like it. But I think now is a time where we want to make sure that we're reaching out to somebody every day and connecting, and just having even a 1-minute phone call or Skype or whatever. I think that's a very, very important thing to do. We need contact with the people around us right now.
That's very good advice, Christine. I could add that my family and I, my siblings, we tend to be a bit, well, we're Luddites actually when it comes to technology. But we have now set up a weekly Zoom chat that brings us all together. And it's so odd because why didn't we think of that before? And so there are some things coming out of this that I think will be helpful. I have a specific question here from someone who is suffering from some sleep deprivation and wondering whether you have any suggestions on how to address insomnia that's brought on by stress and anxiety.
Yeah, so insomnia is a very common result of stress and anxiety and other kinds of issues. So I would say two things about it. First of all, if I had a cure, I'd be so rich. Um, but I think one of the first things with insomnia is to accept that you're having trouble sleeping. We tend to treat it as a problem that must be solved. And we can get very intense about it, and we can organize our day around, I have to figure out how to get to sleep tonight. And then, like, regulating our meals, regulating our caffeine, getting our sleepy time tea, getting our and really putting a lot of effort into this idea that I must sleep. And ironically, that really puts pressure on us to fall asleep. And so instead, what we want to do is accept that we're going to have difficulty sleeping, recognize that, yes, it's going to make us less happy the next day because we're not getting a full night's sleep. But we need to treat it as an issue to accept, and it's something that's going to take a little bit of time to turn around. So there are a couple of things about insomnia. One is, if the reason for the insomnia is that you're in bed going, okay, so tomorrow I have to, and oh, what about this, and sort of ruminating, then that's not, you're never going to sleep if that's what's happening in your head. And for some people, I know, just getting into bed instantly, boom, it's like everything I've ever done in my life that I've regretted and everything I need to do that's challenging is suddenly like floating around my head. And I think the most important thing when that's happening is to get back out of bed. So we don't stay in bed when we're not sleeping. And I know that sounds harsh and awful, but it actually works. So if you wake up at 4 a.m. and you're stewing, you don't stew in bed, you get up and you go read, you go do something else. And then when you're starting to feel sleepy again, you get back into bed. The other part of it is recognizing when your mind is romping ahead into the future or visiting the closed doors of the past and knocking on those doors. And it's really important to keep your spotlight on the present. And at night, when these worries start to come in, is say, that's something I will deal with tomorrow. That is something that I will have time to deal with tomorrow if it's still a problem. And you can try for the first half hour, you try like doing your counting backwards from 100, and every time you have another thought, you have to start back at 100. If that doesn't work, you get out of bed and do something else. And what will happen is over time, you'll get physically tired enough that you actually will start sleeping better. The other thing is about getting physical exercise during the day and making sure that you're having exercise where actually your heart rate is actually increasing for at least 30, 40 minutes so that your body's tired. Because when we're in this slump, like we're not getting, some of us aren't getting a lot of exercise, our bodies aren't tired, and that works against us. So those are several things. I would say that there are some resources on our Center for Mental Health Research and Treatment website. So one of them is on insomnia. So those are slight suggestions. It's worth following them up with doing looking at those resources as well.
Thank you, Christine. I've got a couple of questions here that I think I might combine because people are coming up with similar concerns, and they're concerns around caring for others. So I'll just read some of these questions and then ask if you need a refresher, I can read them again.
Okay.
So one person asks how to support someone who's living alone and feels depressed as a result. Another person also says, if you feel you're not too stressed yourself, how do you help those in your household who are stressed or anxious, not necessarily because of financial issues, but because of the lack of change and meeting with friends? So how do we offer support to family and friends, whether in our household or people who are living alone, without burning ourselves out?
Excellent questions. So I would say, first of all, one thing we really need to keep in mind is that moods are contagious. So when we're reaching out to people, it's very natural for us to immediately start talking about COVID-19, the stresses that we have, the ways it's affected our lives, et cetera. And if we don't shift the conversation, we're going to end up escalating each other's stress and hopelessness and helplessness and fear. So what I suggest to people is a three-part conversation. First part of the conversation is the venting. And this should be a shorter part of the conversation. So you update each other with, I'm so scared about this and I'm having trouble with this. And then the other person gets their turn. The next part of the conversation is, what are the creative ways? What are the things that we're doing about this? And what are some fun ways we found to engage our children? What are some fun activities that we're doing with our children? So move to constructive problem solving. The third part of the conversation is shifting the conversation altogether to something that you have in common with this person that's got nothing to do with COVID-19. So talk about gardening, talk about the weather, talk about what Netflix series you've been watching, talk about what music you're listening to, Spotify, share playlists, but move yourselves out of that anxiety, stress, fretting, worrisome rut. So I think that's really important. The other thing I would say too is that we tend to move towards reassuring people who are anxious and trying to, kind of say, well, here, well, don't worry about that, and trying to reassure them. That actually, as many people may by now have found out, it actually doesn't work that well because the anxiety is relentless. It can always find a yes, but because what the person's wanting is certainty, and you can't provide that. The person who's depressed and lonely, you can't make them undepressed or unlonely. What you can do is shift conversation to uplifting, interesting, engaging, funny stories. You can send people funny memes. You can send them cat videos. You can do things to shift people's mindset out of the focus on what's going wrong. And that's the best gift you can give people.
Thank you. I have another question here that I think we'd like to have you address. This individual says, I've seen a lot of advice for those experiencing mental health issues for the first time during this pandemic. Would you have any particular advice for those who suffered from anxiety or depression prior to the social isolation?
Yeah, so I think there are people who are developing mental health problems for sure. I think we do want to make a distinction between feeling stressed and having a quantified mental health issue. For people who have had mental health problems before, stress will exacerbate them for sure, it can make you more vulnerable for that kind of exacerbation. I think what's really important is if you've had good treatment for these issues before, if you've had good psychotherapy, if you've had strategies in the past that work, definitely make sure that you're using them. I think it's very important to be mindful. So if people have had an episode of depression in the past, that it can be quite the depression when triggered by stress can start to help slip you back in by bringing up that critical voice, inviting you to ruminate, like which is thinking past about the past mistakes and regrets and things that didn't go well in a very negative cycle that you can't get out of because you can't change the past. And I think it's really helpful for people to be quite mindful of when the anxiety and the mood are starting to get back into the driver's seat and butt them out of the driver's seat, like to be very mindful of what kinds of thoughts, what kinds of fears are going through your mind, and switch to back to constructive, productive, happy things in your life.
Thank you. I think we're running out of time, but I think we have time for one more question. And so I'm going to, and I do apologize to those of you who we weren't able to get to. What advice do you have to support children who feel that life sucks at the moment?
Yeah, I know, poor children. First of all, I think validating that life sucks is really important. So don't try to talk it pretty for them. But what you can do is say, how can we make things suck less? Like, what are some things we can do that would like, so whether it's building in some more treats, doing some board games, like just finding creative ways of engaging, like doing TikTok videos, or finding diversionary things, but at the same time validating, yeah, this really sucks. I think it's also important, like you don't want to get into, well, when I was a child kind of thing, but I think it's important to help kids recognize that by doing what they're doing, they're actually valiant protectors of society, like that it's helping reframe their role, that what they're doing by staying home is protecting their grandparents, they're protecting babies, they're protecting their neighbors. So it's an act, it's not a passive inhibition on what you're doing. It's an active act of social responsibility and compassion. And I think so validating that it may not be fun, but helping them recognize too that kids for generations have come through lots of different tragedies and difficulties. And if we think of the bombing of Britain, for example, where people for months had to run down into underground every night from an air raid siren, never knowing what they were going to come up to. So helping kids recognize that there are times in history where where things are not going to be the status quo that we're used to, and that this is a very interesting time. It's a time that they're going to be telling their kids about, and that finding creative ways of adapting to it is noble.
Thank you so much, Christine. I think we do need to stop now. We have run out of time. I want to offer my very profound thanks to Dr. Purdon for her thoughtful and compassionate contributions, not only during the current crisis, but also in your day-to-day work over the years.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also want to thank all of you, our audience, for your participation. I know that there's so much interest in the topic that we probably haven't been able to address everything you're interested in. I would like to draw your attention to the additional resources that are available. We've put this up on the slide, and so I'm pointing you towards the Center for Mental Health Research and Treatment, as well as UW's Employee and Family Assistance Program. So these websites are posted in the chat for this presentation, and a recording of the presentation will be up on YouTube shortly. In closing, I would like to remind you all about our next community talk, which will take place next Wednesday, May 13th. And the topic will be long-term care and our loved ones with Dr. John Hurdes from the School of Public Health and Health Systems. So please go to www.uwaterloo.ca/community for more information. We hope to see you there. And in the meantime, please take care of yourselves, those around you. Thank you.